Chapter 2 moves us from organizations as systems to the people inside them. One of the most common leadership mistakes is assuming that everyone thinks, reacts, and is motivated the same way we are. This chapter helps us understand individual differences, not so we can label people, but so we can lead them more effectively. Some organizations take personality and values very seriously. Bridgewater Associates is a good example. They believe how people think and respond under pressure matters just as much as the technical skills. And honestly, if you've ever led a team, you already know this. Two people can be given the same task, the same deadline, and the same resources and respond in completely different ways. That's what this chapter helps explain. When we talk about personality, we're talking about relatively stable patterns in how people think, how they feel, how they behave. This isn't about moods, and it's not about skills. It's about tendencies. About half of personality comes from genetics and about half from the environment. Over time, it becomes more stable, but it's not frozen. The leadership takeaway here is important. Our job isn't to change people's personalities. Our job is to understand how those tendencies show up at work and how to lead accordingly. We always like to discuss and debate the nature versus nurture of personality. When we talk about nature, heredity explains up to 50% of behavior and 30% of temperament preferences. Nurture, socialization, life experiences, and other interactions with the environment also affect personality. Personalities tend to stabilize in young adulthood by around age 30. We form a clearer, more rigid self-concept as we get older. We develop an executive function in part of the brain that monitors and regulates goal-directed behavior and tries to keep our behavior consistent with self-concept. Some personality changes continue to change. For example, agreeableness from the Big Five. Conscientiousness tends to increase throughout to later in life. Or for example, openness to experience. Social vitality increases to young adulthood and then it declines in later years. The most widely accepted personality framework in OB is the Big Five. This doesn't tell us everything about a person, but it gives us a useful starting point. Extroversion is about how energized someone is by social interaction. Extroverts often enjoy influence and visibility, but introverts often excel at listening and deep thinking. Both can be great leaders. Conscientiousness is one of the strongest predictors of job performance. These are your organized, reliable people, great at follow-through. The downside? They can struggle when things are constantly changing. Agreeableness shows up in teamwork. Highly agreeable people care about harmony and relationships, which is great, but sometimes they avoid conflict that actually needs to happen. Neuroticism, or emotional stability, affects how people handle stress. Leaders with higher emotional stability tend to stay calmer under pressure. And openness to experience is about curiosity and adaptability. This really matters in innovative or fast-changing environments. One important point here, higher scores are not automatically better. The best trait profile depends on the role and the situation. Personality mainly affects behavior and performance through motivation, influences direction, and intensity of effort. All Big Five dimensions predict an individual's behavior to some extent. Some specific traits might be better predictors than the overall dimension. Also, the personality effect on behavior can also be nonlinear, and so maybe moderate is better than too little or too much. Now, we have certain personality predictors of proficient task performance. First, conscientiousness is the best personality predictor of that proficient task performance, especially industrious, achievement, self-discipline, purposeful, and dutifulness. They set higher goals and they're more persistent. Another predictor is extroversion. That's the second best personality predictor of proficient task performance, especially of traits of assertiveness and positive emotionality. Assertive employees will frame situations as challenges rather than threats. We also have personality predictors of adaptive task performance. Emotional stability, meaning low neuroticism. They can cope with ambiguity and uncertainty of change. Extroversion, especially assertiveness, is comfortable influencing others and engaging with environment. And openness to experience have more curiosity, imagination, and tolerance of change. We also have personality predictors of proactive task performance. Extroversion, especially assertiveness, is comfortable influencing others, engaging with the environment. Openness to experience have more curiosity, imagination, and tolerance of change. And we have personality predictors of organizational citizenship that we talked about previously. Conscientiousness, they're more dutiful and dependable. Agreeableness, those tend to be more motivated to be cooperative, sensitive, flexible, and supportive. And we also have personality predictors of counterproductive work behaviors. Conscientiousness, that negative correlation. People with low conscientiousness are less dependable and feel less obligation towards others. In agreeableness, the negative correlation, people with low agreeableness are less caring of others and less need to be liked. Effective leaders and salespeople tend to be somewhat more extroverted than the general population. They're good at influencing others, being comfortable in social situations, things like that. Openness to experience is associated with successful performance in creative work. And conscientiousness is usually a weak predictor of adaptive and proactive performance. They require more structure, more clarity. Agreeableness, fairly good personality predictor of performance as team members and in customer service jobs. A weaker predictor of proficient or proactive task performance, that lower motivation to set goals, achieve results, things like that. I want to say this, personality models explain tendencies and they are not guarantees. They don't capture everything and they don't excuse behavior. Leaders should use personality insights as diagnostic tools, not as labels or justification. Higher Big Five scores aren't necessarily better. And specific traits might predict better than the overall Big Five factors. And personality isn't static. And the other issue with this model is it doesn't cover all personalities. The dark triad gets a lot of attention because these traits often show up in leadership roles. Machiavellianism is about manipulation and winning at all cost. Narcissism involves entitlement and a constant need for recognition. And psychopathy includes impulsivity and lack of empathy. Here's the tricky part. People high in these traits can sometimes look successful in the short term, but over time, they tend to damage trust, culture, and ethical standards. Again, this isn't about diagnosing people, it's about recognizing patterns and building systems that prevent harm. In summarizing the past few slides, the five-factor model development excluded explicitity, the positive-negative valence words. The dark triad re-examined personality clusters with valences, 3 socially undesirable personality traits of Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. The dark triad are Machiavellism, narcissism, psychopathy are prevalent throughout the workplace. You can see them in organizational politics, using influence tactics for personal gain at the expense of others and the interest of the entire organization. The dark triad motivates political tactics because dishonesty and malevolently undermining others are core characteristics. You also see serious white-collar crime activity here, and this is significantly predicted by the dark triad. Lesser counterproductive work activities are predicted better by the big five. We have workplace aggression and bullying, and this is significantly predicted by psychopathy. There's poor decision making associated with psychopathy, excessive risk due to overconfidence, disregard for consequences, things like that. And then ineffective team behaviors. And this is a complex effect. It's helpful in the short term to gain favors, but long term distrust coworkers and focus on their own goals at the expense of the team. Now, the dark triad may have some positive outcomes, okay? Manipulative political skill, some supervisors rate favorably and can result in higher power by gaining more central positions. Narcissistic CEOs, higher direct pay, higher pay gap from other executives. Overall, psychopathy personality is negatively associated with career success, but some experts note career success of those with psychopathy element of fearless dominance. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung proposed that personality is primarily represented by the individual's preferences regarding perceiving the environment and judging and obtaining processing information. You probably have heard of the Myers-Briggs type indicator. Many of you may have even taken this test before. Sometimes it's referred to as MBTI. And this test estimates Jungian personality types. Extroversion versus introversion, which is similar to the 5-factor dimension we discussed previously. Perceiving information, S and N. Sensing is perceiving information directly through the 5 senses to acquire factual and quantitative details. Intuition relies on insight and subjective experience. Then there's judging, making decisions, T and F, thinking and feeling. In orientation towards the outside world, P and J, that perceiving, open to curious, spontaneous to events, prefer to keep options open kind of thing. Judging, prefer world order, structure, and want to resolve problems quickly. Now, the Myers-Briggs is the most widely used personality test, and that's why I suggested that maybe you have taken this before. It's one of the most widely studied measures of cognitive style. And it adopts a neutral view of score results, higher versus lower or different, not better or worse. It improves self-awareness and mutual understanding, for example, good for career counseling and executive coaching. It is, however, poor at predicting job performance, effective leadership, or even team development. And so leaders should use it as a conversation starter, not a decision tool. Values are different from personality. They're about what we believe should matter. Values guide decisions, especially when trade-offs are required. Schwartz's values model helps explain why people prioritize things differently. Stability versus change, self-interest versus concern for others. Leaders often assume shared values that don't actually exist, and that's where conflict starts. For example, a leader might value innovation while an employee values security. That's not a character flaw, it's a values difference that leadership has to navigate. Now, the Schwartz's value model is a dominant model of personal values, and it was developed and tested by social psychologist Shalom Schwartz and many others. And so I'm not going to go through all of these, but there are 57 specific values cluster into 10 broad value categories. And then there are further clustered into 4 quadrants. But you'll see some of the same words and terms as you saw from the original model, the Big Five: openness to change, things like that. Now, IKEA describes itself as a values-driven company, so job applicants need to reflect on whether their personal values are congruent with the global retailer's organizational values. And they're a great example of how a company can use those traits to hire and develop a team that fits their culture. Values affect the relative attractiveness of choices. They frame perceptions. And values motivate us to act consistently with self-concept and public image. Sometimes, though, values don't predict behavior. A couple examples of that are situational factors, barriers, or lack of opportunity. For example, it's more difficult to be environmentally friendly if there's no recycling facilities. Another factor would be counter-motivational forces, coercion from others, threat of job loss. That motivates people to engage in unethical business activities. And another area where values don't predict behavior is lack of values awareness or salience. We often ignore values in our decisions and actions because values are abstract. It's difficult to link to a specific behavior. And behavior is often routine, so less mindful of consistency with personal values. Now, values congruence is how similar a person's values hierarchy is to the values hierarchy of the organization, a coworker, or even another source. That congruence with team values is higher team cohesion and performance. Congruence with an organization's values generates high job satisfaction, loyalty, and organizational citizenship, lower stress, lower turnover. Notice that we use values congruence, plural, not value congruence, because values operate as a set, not individually. Also, value is easily confused with the economic concept of worth, something related to price. Now, ethics involves evaluating whether actions are right or wrong and whether outcomes are good or bad. Leaders constantly make ethical decisions under pressure and with incomplete information. Moral intensity matters. When consequences are significant and affect many people, ethical awareness must increase. Ethical leadership isn't just about rules. It's about culture, modeling, and systems. And so we can define ethics as the study of moral principles or values that determine whether actions are right or wrong and outcomes are good or bad. And in this framework, we have 4 ethical principles: utilitarianism, individual rights, distributive justice, and ethic of care. Utilitarianism seeks the greatest good for the greatest number of people, the highest overall satisfaction to those that are affected. The problem with that is the cost-benefit analysis. Many outcomes just aren't measurable. Another problem is it focuses on the consequences, but means of achieving those consequences could be immoral. The second one, the individual rights principle, is basically everyone has the same natural rights, moral norm of society, not just legal rights. For example, freedom of speech. Problem with that is conflicting rights. Shareholders' right to be informed could conflict with the executive's right to privacy. And the third one, distributive justice. The benefits and burdens similar to individuals should be the same, otherwise should be proportional. For example, those who contribute equally in their work should receive similar rewards. Those who contribute less should receive lower rewards. Inequalities are acceptable when they benefit the least well off. The problem here is it's difficult to agree on similar rewards and contributions and what factors and reward distribution are, quote, relevant. And finally, ethic of care. Caring for others is a fundamental characteristic of humanity. Everyone has a moral obligation to help others within the relational sphere to grow and self-actualize. This principle emphasizes partiality, whereas other principles value impartiality. It includes being attentive to others' needs, showing responsibility for others, giving care to others, having empathy for others. And it's a core concept in stakeholder theory and servant leadership. Now, the degree that an issue demands the application of ethical principles should be addressed here. Moral intensity is higher when the decision has substantially good or bad consequences. High agreement among others that outcomes are good or bad, not diverse beliefs. And a higher probability that good-bad outcomes will occur from the decision, and if many people are affected by the decision. In summary, moral intensity matters. When decisions affect many people or have serious consequences, leaders need to slow down and be more intentional. A person's ability to detect a moral dilemma and estimate its relative importance is key in leadership. More quickly and accurately estimate an issue's moral intensity is essential for leadership. Not necessarily do they need more ethical behavior, just better awareness of a moral situation. And so moral sensitivity is higher in people with expertise and knowledge of prescriptive norms and rules, for example, expertise in accounting, or past experience with specific dilemmas. Internal cues develop trigger awareness when moral issues arise again. More empathy, more sensitive to the needs and situation of others. A self-view as an ethical person. Put more energy into maintaining ethical conduct. In mindfulness, receptive and impartial attention to and awareness of the present, and to own thoughts and emotions in that moment. Higher moral sensitivity by monitoring the environment. I want to emphasize here, situational factors, including opportunity and motivational forces, also influence people to act contrary to moral principles and personal values. Culture plays a huge role here. People take cues from what leaders reward, tolerate, and model. And so corporations developed a code of ethics. You'll see these on almost every large company's website. They describe the firm's described practices, rules of conduct, philosophies in relation to stakeholders, the environment, things like that. The problem with the code of ethics is its limited effect on ethical conduct. And so we have to educate and evaluate employee knowledge of our ethical conduct for our culture. For example, knowledge of ethics code for our company, desired ethical behaviors in various situations. Other ways to support ethical behavior is having systems for communicating impartially investigating wrongdoing. Maybe confidential ethics hotlines, websites, things like that. Ethics audits. And lastly, another way to support ethical behavior is through ethical culture and leadership. The firm's value should be aligned with the ethical conduct. Ethical conduct and vigilance of corporate leaders is essential. They are the role model of the ethical standards. Now, here you see an example of Suntory Holdings Ltd. CEO Takeshi Nami, sorry I butchered that name, recognized that differences in cross-cultural values could be a concern when the Japanese beverage company acquired Jim Beam, which makes bourbon in Kentucky. Cultural values influence expectations about authority, uncertainty, competition, and relationships. Leaders working across cultures or even regions within the same country must adjust their assumptions about communication, power, and motivation. Cultural awareness improves leadership, effectiveness, and it reduces unintentional conflict. Now, when we talk about cultural diversity within the United States, there is a deep level diversity across ethnic groups and also regional groups. Ethnic values diversity. Higher individualism among African Americans compared to Americans with European, Hispanic, or Asian origins. Asian Americans have the lowest individualism among these different graphic groups. And then just some examples of regional variations in collectivism. The highest would be southern states. The South, flies that flag, California, Hawaii. Lowest variations would be in the mountains, Northwest, the Great Plains states, things like that. Chapter 2 reinforces a core leadership truth. People are different, and those differences matter. Effective leaders don't ignore personality and values, and they don't weaponize them. They design roles, expectations, and systems that allow diverse people to contribute productively. As we move forward, keep asking, how might individual differences be shaping this behavior, and what does leadership require in response?